On 17th December 1944, outside the Belgian town of Stavelo, the fuel indicator inside a German Tiger II pointed stubbornly to empty, though SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, commander of Kampfgruppe Peiper of the 1st SS Panzer Division, needed no instrument to confirm what he already knew. Looking through the periscope of his command tank, he observed long lines of American transport vehicles racing along a distant road, their engines consuming, in a single hour, more gasoline than his entire battle group had carried into the Ardennes. Peiper's own tank stood dead, its 860-liter fuel reservoir exhausted, only a few kilometers short of what was supposed to be the most decisive logistical target of Operation Wacht im Rhein, a vast American fuel stockpile near Spa, containing 2.2 million gallons of gasoline. The German spearhead, designed to punch a hole through Allied lines, had stalled within sight of precisely the resource it needed most. Years later, during his testimony at the post-war Dachau trials, Peiper recalled the scene with unmistakable frustration. He described being close enough to sense the gasoline fumes drifting from the depot, watching as his tanks, mechanical powerhouses intended to lead the breakthrough, became nothing more than inert metal shells. Across the valley, American engineers and local Belgian workers were already preparing charges to destroy whatever portion of the depot could not be hauled away in time. To Peiper, the view represented not only personal failure, but the collapse of an entire strategic gamble. By his own estimate, the fuel visible from his position would have kept his Kampfgruppe operational for half a year. The depot held more petroleum at one location than the entire 6th SS Panzer Army possessed for the Herbst offensive. The imbalance was so extreme that later, American forces deliberately burned over 1 million gallons to prevent German capture. In that moment, the logistical divide between the two armies, the disparity measured in barrels, gallons, and tanker convoys, could not have been more stark. The shortage choking the Wehrmacht in the Ardennes was only the latest symptom of a problem rooted in Germany's structural lack of natural resources. Archival Wehrmacht records, preserved in the Bundesarchiv, outline the uncomfortable arithmetic. In 1941, Germany's total oil production, including synthetic fuel generated from coal, reached only 5.7 million tons. In the same year, the United States produced 180 million tons, with access to roughly 300 million additional tons from Allied partners. This 100-to-1 disadvantage meant that no amount of daring maneuvers or battlefield ingenuity could compensate for the fuel deficits that plagued German operations. For the Ardennes attack, Hitler assured Field Marshal von Rundstedt that 5 million gallons would be provided. In practice, the Wehrmacht succeeded in gathering approximately that amount, but transport constraints, chiefly rail congestion and Allied bombing, reduced the usable quantity to 3.17 million gallons on the eve of the offensive, 16 December 1944. Even this enlarged reserve was calculated to last no more than 6 days of active fighting. German planners understood they possessed fuel for only 1/3 to 1/2 of the necessary distance to reach Antwerp, and that was assuming minimal combat resistance.
Major Joachim Dietrich, quartermaster of the 2nd Panzer Division, summarized the problem bluntly in his diary. Vehicles had enough fuel for 90 to 100 miles, yet Antwerp lay at least 125 miles away. Under combat conditions, where maneuvering, idling, and route changes would double normal consumption, the math grew impossible. The orders emphasized a single solution: seize American fuel dumps, or the offensive would die on the roadside. The success of the entire winter campaign depended on the capture of Allied gasoline. While German armored units increasingly found themselves stranded, awaiting fuel that never arrived, the American supply system was demonstrating a logistical achievement unmatched in contemporary warfare. The famed Red Ball Express, operating from late August to mid-November 1944, formed a relentless flow of trucks running day and night along designated one-way supply routes stretching from the Normandy coast to the advancing front. At its operational peak, the network moved 12,500 tons of material per day. First Lieutenant Charles Woe, serving with the 36th 32nd Quartermaster Truck Company, one of the predominantly African-American units that sustained the system, recorded the operation's staggering scale. On a good day, his company alone transported about 50,000 gallons of fuel. Merely keeping the supply trucks moving consumed approximately 300,000 gallons daily, a quantity greater than what the Germans had available for offensive armored operations. Woe recalled incidents where drivers spilled fuel while refilling tanks, sometimes losing 50 gallons in a single mistake. His lieutenant reportedly shrugged, reminding the men that the system counted not in barrels or jerry cans, but in shiploads. The Ardennes thus became a battleground defined not only by terrain and tactics, but by the contrasting industrial capacities of the opposing sides. Where the German attack relied on capturing fuel to sustain itself, the American war machine operated on a scale so vast that logistical waste barely registered. In the end, the campaign's outcome was determined as much by economics and infrastructure as by guns and armor, a truth visible to Joachim Peiper on that cold December day as he stared at the fuel he could see but never reach. The scale of Allied transport operations can be understood through the figures preserved in the records of the Transportation Corps. Roughly 6,000 trucks ran day and night along roadways reserved solely for military use. Over a span of 82 days, these vehicles hauled an extraordinary 412,193 tons of material to the rapidly advancing forces. Although ammunition, rations, and equipment traveled in these convoys, petroleum dominated the cargo. It was this constant stream of fuel that allowed Patton's Third Army and Hodge's First Army to burn through a combined 800,000 gallons each as they chased the German forces across France. What German planners of the upcoming December offensive were unaware of was that the Allies had already solved the very fuel shortages Berlin expected them to suffer. An engineering achievement unprecedented in wartime, the Pluto project, had quietly transformed the logistical landscape. This effort placed flexible undersea fuel lines beneath the English Channel, creating a hidden artery between Britain and the continent. After the predictable early setbacks, the system was approaching a remarkable throughput by December 1944, close to 1 million gallons every day.
Captain Bernard Williams, a Standard Oil petroleum specialist overseeing much of Pluto's activity, captured the magnitude of this achievement in one of his reports. According to him, the Allies were moving nearly 3,000 tons of fuel a day through pipes on the seabed, while German strategists were still measuring their available fuel in mere barrels. Williams noted that a single functioning line from the Pluto network could move more fuel in 24 hours than all of Germany's synthetic fuel plants produced in the same time. Once ashore, this petroleum infrastructure expanded rapidly. By the end of 1944, American engineers had laid 3,000 miles of pipelines across France and Belgium, forming what amounted to a circulatory system for Allied fuel distribution. Every major depot connected to this network was capable of receiving supplies independent of weather conditions, damaged railways, or Luftwaffe activity. In the region between Spa and Stavelot stood one of the most impressive concentrations of fuel storage on the continent. Depot number 2 near Spa held 2,226,000 gallons, while Depot number 3 at Stavelot stored another 1,115,000 gallons. Together, these facilities contained more than 3.3 million gallons, exceeding the total amount of fuel the German High Command had allocated for the entirety of its winter offensive. Staff Sergeant James Morrison of the 25th Quartermaster Battalion left a vivid description of daily life in the Stavelot depot. According to him, the site was crowded with pyramids of jerry cans, long ranks of tanker trucks, and underground tanks brimming with gasoline. He recalled receiving yet another shipment of 200,000 gallons in a single day. When he asked how they were expected to store it, his captain simply replied that they would stack it higher. Supplies were so plentiful that if German aircraft came near and a portion could not be relocated in time, some of it was deliberately set ablaze to prevent destruction of the depot itself. One such sacrifice destroyed 124,000 gallons, an amount treated as a minor inconvenience rather than a significant loss. The depot's paperwork shows an average daily intake of 200,000 gallons and an issue rate of 180,000 gallons, ensuring that reserves increased steadily. By the morning of December 17th, as Kampfgruppe Peiper's spearhead moved toward the area, the Spa-Stavelot fuel complex held enough gasoline to operate the entire German Wehrmacht's fleet of vehicles for roughly 4 months. On the German side of the lines, the armored formations moving into the Ardennes represented exceptional engineering trapped by catastrophic fuel requirements. The Tiger II, driven by a powerful 700-horsepower Maybach engine, consumed about 2.75 gallons per mile on paved surfaces and more than double that when forced onto rough ground. With an internal capacity of 860 liters, the tank's operational range barely reached 60 miles before refueling became mandatory. Feldwebel Hans Simon, who drove Tiger II No. 332, described in his diary how his tank began the offensive fully fueled, yet after only 35 kilometers, the gauge had dropped to halfway. Allied air attacks forced his crew onto poor terrain, worsening consumption. By nightfall, they were nearly dry, yet still ordered to push forward with almost nothing left in the fuel lines.
Even the Panther, nominally more fuel efficient, could achieve barely half a mile per gallon under combat conditions. A battalion of 60 Panthers required about 15,000 gallons merely to advance 30 miles while under pressure. Kampfgruppe Peiper's entire fuel allotment for the offensive, 180,000 gallons, was effectively enough to support one major engagement and left virtually nothing in reserve for exploiting any gains. Peiper later stated before the DHI tribunal that his column had been instructed to advance only as far as their fuel would take them and then seize American supplies by force. According to his testimony, the mission scarcely resembled a conventional military push. Instead, it felt like a sanctioned raid. "We weren't acting as soldiers," he remarked, "but as men scavenging for gasoline. And even at that, we failed." One of the few notable windfalls came on 17th December when an element of Kampfgruppe Peiper stumbled upon a massive American fuel site near Bulge. The depot, holding roughly 50,000 gallons, was protected by only a handful of U.S. support troops who fled as German armor appeared. Veteran Unterscharführer Georg Fleps later recalled their astonishment: jerry cans piled high, fuel trucks left with engines cold and keys waiting in the ignition. Every usable container was hastily filled. It was like stumbling onto an oasis, he remembered. Yet even this trove, impressive as it seemed, was barely enough to push the column a modest distance toward the Meuse River. The discovery also highlighted an often overlooked aspect of Allied advantage: fuel quality. Each American container was neatly labeled 80, 85, 100 octane, signaling fuel tailored for distinct machines. High-octane blends for aircraft, specialized grades for engines with particular requirements. By contrast, German formations typically relied on synthetically produced gasoline of such low quality that it routinely harmed engines and reduced horsepower significantly. Amid the seizure of the Bulge depot, Peiper's men also took 50 American prisoners who were compelled to refuel German vehicles under guard. Once their forced labor was complete, the prisoners were executed, a brutal event that would become a central accusation in Peiper's post-war trial and a stark indicator of the unit's desperation to keep its tanks moving. The next day, 18th December, at Hansveld-Thiermont-Trois-Ponts, Peiper's forward advance was halted not by combat but by the systematic destruction of key bridges. Engineers of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, led by Major Robert Bull Yates, demolished the Amblev Bridge shortly before noon, then destroyed the St. Louis Bridge just minutes after German vehicles appeared. These actions forced Peiper to veer north toward La Glaise, a route far removed from the large fuel stores he had intended to capture intact. Engineers of the 291st Battalion later recalled watching German heavy armor, Tigers and Panthers, approach majestically but sluggishly. Captain John Wilson explained that the German crews were running on their last fumes, and every demolished bridge forced them to circle back, burning more of the fuel they could least afford to spend. "We were defeating them," Wilson said, "not by firepower, but by making them waste time and gasoline." The diversions proved crucial. By the time Peiper's spearhead reached the outskirts of La Glaise, most vehicles were nearly empty. The entire formation had advanced less than 50 miles from its start point, yet had already exhausted a significant portion of its fuel. On 19 December, the lead elements came within reach of an enormous American supply complex near Stavelot-Stumont, where some 2.2 million gallons had previously been stored. But U.S. forces had already begun evacuating the depot, and any remaining fuel was set ablaze or removed before German troops could seize it. Peiper radioed repeatedly for resupply. In response, on 22 December, the Luftwaffe attempted an airdrop. 35 Ju-52 transports were dispatched, but only 10 reached the intended drop zone. Their combined delivery, barely 1,100 gallons, was almost useless. Many containers ruptured on impact, others landed behind American lines. The amount that reached Peiper's men would have powered only a handful of tanks for a few miles. By 24th December, Peiper faced the inevitable. Of 4,800 soldiers and 800 vehicles that began the operation, including 117 armored fighting vehicles, a huge portion was now stranded. He ordered the abandonment of over 130 vehicles around La Glaise, 6 Tiger II heavy tanks, 13 Panthers, 6 Panzer IVs, and dozens of additional armored carriers and trucks. Nearly all were mechanically sound, lacking only fuel. Peiper reflected bitterly that his crews were among the best in the Wehrmacht and that their machines were the most formidable Germany had ever fielded. Yet they were forced to leave them behind with empty tanks and withdraw on foot as American motorized columns rolled past. On 17 December, at the crossroads near Malmedy, Kampfgruppe Peiper carried out what would become the most infamous atrocity committed by German forces on the Western Front: the murder of 84 American prisoners from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. Survivors later testified that the Germans appeared consumed by urgency. Technical Sergeant William O. McMurray, who lived by feigning death, recalled officers glancing repeatedly at their watches and arguing intensely about fuel consumption and the need to maintain speed. "They shot us because stopping would slow them down," he said. "They couldn't afford even minutes of delay." The tragedy encapsulated the larger irony of the Ardennes offensive. German troops killed prisoners in the belief that their progress had to remain swift at all costs, yet ultimately their entire advance collapsed not due to American firepower, but because their fuel tanks ran dry long before reaching any meaningful objective. While German armored units sat stalled for lack of fuel, American troops moved with an ease that astonished and discouraged enemy observers. U.S. forces behaved as though gasoline were an inexhaustible resource. In the bitter cold, Sherman crews often left their engines idling simply to heat the fighting compartments, consuming fuel at a rate the Germans found unbelievable. Soldiers thought nothing of driving a jeep a short distance instead of walking. All along American positions, generators hummed through the night, powering floodlights, film reels, and even coffee pots, luxuries entirely out of reach for the fuel-strapped Wehrmacht.
Private First Class Anthony Caruso of the 3915th Quartermaster Gas Supply Company later recalled the casualness with which his unit handled their supplies. According to him, tanks were drained after only a few days, not because the fuel was unusable, but because regulations required fresh batches. German prisoners who watched them discard hundreds of gallons reacted almost violently. One captured sergeant even pleaded to fill his small canteen with the discarded fuel. When the Americans laughed off the request, he reportedly told them they were mocking the death of Germany itself. Similar impressions surfaced in reports from U.S. officers. Captain Robert Johnson of the 14th Cavalry Group noted that his men consumed more gasoline during a single freezing night simply to stay warm than a German panzer company possessed for actual combat operations. The contrast was stark. For Americans, the basic unit of measurement was the fuel depot. For Germans, it was the single jerrycan. Johnson concluded that the conflict had ceased to resemble a contest between equivalent military machines. It had become a confrontation between a fully mobilized industrial giant and an opponent collapsing under shortages. By the final week of December, U.S. Army engineers had pushed fuel pipelines to within roughly 30 miles of the front. The growing network represented more than logistical convenience. It embodied a core American doctrine, permanent infrastructure that followed the advance and guaranteed fuel flow regardless of battlefield uncertainty. Captain Eugene Smith of the 697th Engineer Petroleum Distribution Company described the pace of their work bluntly. His crews were laying pipe directly across the Ardennes battlefield while enemy bodies had not yet cooled. By New Year's Day, they were delivering over 100,000 gallons daily to territory the Germans had relinquished simply because they could no longer supply their own forces. Smith remarked that every additional mile of pipeline felt like sealing another section of the German army's fate.
The main trunk running from Cherbourg toward the German frontier eventually reached the capacity to push 4 million gallons per day, accomplished without relying on a single fuel truck. Such infrastructure granted American commanders something close to immunity from the logistical constraints that immobilized German armored formations. Nowhere was this disparity more dramatically displayed than in the relief of Bastogne. During the height of the crisis, Patton's Third Army executed a near-impossible 90-degree turn and advanced more than 100 miles in harsh winter weather, committing 3 full divisions to smash into the German flank. This rapid maneuver burned through approximately 800,000 gallons in just 3 days, an amount nearly equal to the entire German fuel stockpile designated for their winter offensive. Colonel Walter Mueller, Patton's logistics chief, recounted the exchange that preceded the push. Patton asked if they had enough fuel to execute the maneuver. Mueller presented the figures: 2 million gallons on hand and another million scheduled for delivery each day. Patton cut him off, reportedly saying, "Quit adding numbers and get moving." The Third Army consumed more fuel on its way to Bastogne than German armored forces possessed for their drive toward Antwerp. Meanwhile, German formations attempting to encircle Bastogne were already suffering critical shortages. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had pushed closest to the Meuse River, had been forced to stretch fuel intended for 30 miles of operation over a 60-mile advance. Their offensive power evaporated not through defeat in battle, but through the simple inability to keep their engines running. They remained stuck in full view of the objective they had fought so hard to reach, pleading for fuel that simply did not exist anywhere within their grasp. In contrast, the isolated American 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne offered a striking reminder of how overwhelming U.S. logistical capacity had become. Even though the division was completely surrounded, its vehicles, heaters, and generators never went dry. C-47 transport aircraft repeatedly broke through the weather to drop supplies, among them nearly 5,000 gallons of fuel packed in crash-resistant containers designed specifically for such missions. Sergeant Joseph Belly of the 326th Engineer Battalion later recalled how those drops looked from the ground.
Parachutes drifted downward while German troops watched from the tree line, powerless to intervene. Captured German soldiers were even employed to help gather the containers. They handled the jerry cans in silence, shaking their heads as though trying to understand what they were witnessing. One prisoner finally muttered, bewildered rather than angry, "You deliver gasoline from the sky? You have enough to throw it out of airplanes?" At a moment when the Luftwaffe could barely keep a handful of aircraft fueled, the sight of American planes burning enormous amounts of aviation fuel just to deliver more fuel created a kind of psychological feedback loop, an abundance so effortless that it shattered German morale more effectively than shell fire. By Christmas Day in 1944, Germany's fuel system collapsed entirely. All across the Ardennes, German vehicles stood abandoned. Not because they had been destroyed, but because their tanks had run dry. Near Celles, the 2nd Panzer Division, which had pushed furthest toward the west, ceased to function after exhausting its last reserves only a few miles short of the Meuse River. Major Hans von Luck, attempting to pull the 116th Panzer Division back from its forward positions, later described the scene as a disaster unfolding in slow motion. He recalled American fuel depots where rows of Allied vehicles waited at orderly refueling stations, much like automobiles queuing at civilian gas pumps before the war. Soldiers casually filled tanks with hoses, appearing entirely unhurried. Meanwhile, his own Panther sat immobile less than a kilometer away, perfectly functional, but utterly useless. With no alternatives left, the crews destroyed their machines and walked toward surrender. At Supreme Headquarters, Allied planners recorded fuel numbers that made the German situation even more hopeless. American stockpiles sat at roughly 42 million gallons, with another 1.5 million arriving each day. The Ardennes offensive had increased U.S. fuel consumption from about 800,000 gallons per day to more than 1.2 million, yet the change was treated as a small logistical adjustment. Even under the sudden surge in usage, the Allies still had enough fuel for more than a month of operations. Perhaps the most striking symbol of German defeat was the King Tiger, numbered 332, found near Le Glaise. The vehicle was in excellent condition, its armor intact, its gun untouched, its engine still fully functional, but its fuel tank was empty. That alone had rendered a 68-ton engineering marvel powerless. Its commander, Oberfähnrich Kurt Nippel, one of Germany's most successful tank aces with 168 credited kills, wrote his final report with bitter clarity. He had been forced to destroy a flawlessly working tank solely because it had no fuel. The Americans, he noted, possessed gasoline in quantities that felt limitless. When American troops reached the position the next day, they found the ruined tank beside a neatly coiled siphon hose, the last instrument of an army reduced to scavenging for drops of fuel, while the Allies operated inside what seemed like an ocean of petroleum. Interrogations of captured German officers revealed the deeper arithmetic of the crisis. Major Heinrich Gersel, quartermaster of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, taken prisoner on December 26th, tried to compare his supply situation with what the Americans routinely maintained. He stated bluntly that the smallest U.S. depot contained more fuel than his entire division had received throughout the offensive. Americans measured fuel flow in tanker ship volumes. Germans counted it in barrels. Looking at American records showing allocations of 100,000 gallons a day for a single armored division, Gersel initially refused to accept the numbers as real. Only when shown the actual requisition forms did he believe it. And once he did, he asked, defeated, "Why keep fighting? The war's outcome is already decided. We move in empty tanks. We are already finished." Oberst Friedrich von Mellenthin, serving as operations officer for Army Group B, later compiled the final brutal calculation of the Ardennes fuel situation. To reach Antwerp, the Germans would have needed approximately 4.5 million gallons of fuel. They began the offensive with only about 3.17 million available. Of that, only 2.1 million gallons actually reached frontline units. By December 24th, nearly all of it,
around 2 million gallons, had been consumed. Even the 200,000 gallons taken from captured Allied stores could not change the outcome. The result was inevitable: total paralysis of movement, the death of the offensive, and with it, the final collapse of Germany's ability to wage mechanized war. The severe fuel shortage crippling German ground forces was inseparably tied to the relentless American strategic bombing offensive. By the final weeks of 1944, U.S. air raids had slashed the output of German synthetic fuel plants by roughly 90%, leaving the Wehrmacht's armored formation starved of the petroleum they needed simply to move. The Luna synthetic facility, once capable of turning out about 2,000 tons of product each day, was limping along at barely a tenth of its previous capacity. Then, on December 24th, at the height of Germany's desperate push through the Ardennes, 2,300-plus American bombers struck rail junctions, storage depots, and fuel processing sites across the Reich. Ironically, that single air operation burned through some 5.5 million gallons of aviation fuel, almost twice what Germany had allocated for the entire Ardennes offensive. Lieutenant General Karl Spaatz calculated the imbalance with cold logic. We expend millions of gallons to wipe out a fraction of that amount on their side. Wasteful on paper, decisive in reality. We trade abundance for their scarcity. On the ground, American engineering units illustrated a different angle of this overwhelming fuel advantage. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, which played a major role in the defense of Malmedy, consumed thousands of gallons each day just to keep its heavy equipment running while erecting and maintaining roadblocks. Their D7 bulldozers, running nearly non-stop, drank around 50 gallons an hour. German combat engineers observing them from concealed positions were stunned by what they perceived as limitless mechanization. Hauptmann Werner Kemper of the 12th SS Pioneer Battalion noted in his diary, "The Americans rely on machines for every task. Motorized saws, pneumatic tools, bridge layers, all driven by fuel. Work that would occupy our men for days is completed in a few hours by their machines, which seem to burn gasoline without restraint." The Ardennes campaign laid bare a fundamental truth of modern war: fuel dictated capability. Germany had gathered a sizable strike force, around 250,000 troops, 1,400 armored vehicles, and more than 2,600 artillery pieces. Yet this formidable formation was fatally constrained by a petroleum shortage it could not hope to overcome. Field Marshal Walter Model summarized the situation with brutal clarity: "We cannot extract our mechanized units because we lack the fuel required to save the very forces that require fuel to function. The Americans advance not solely through tactics, but through gasoline. They prevail because they possess it. We falter because we do not." The numbers told the same story. American forces in the European theater had access to roughly 180 million gallons of fuel. German planners, by contrast, scraped together only about 3.17 million gallons for the Ardennes assault. While U.S. logistics delivered up to 4 million gallons daily, German fuel production hovered around only 40,000 gallons, an astounding disparity of roughly 100 to 1. Behind these battlefield statistics stood an industrial gulf. U.S. refineries produced around 5 million barrels of petroleum each day. The Texas-Louisiana industrial zone alone exceeded the total output of all Axis partners combined. The Baytown refinery, operating on its own, processed about 10 million gallons daily, surpassing Germany's entire synthetic fuel network. Although German chemical engineers had pioneered the coal-to-liquid process, their best monthly production never rose above about 120,000 tons. American oil fields yielded close to 15 million tons each month. After the war, Dr. Hinrich Büttner, formerly of IG Farben's synthetic fuel division, summarized the imbalance with stark honesty. "We invested billions of Reichsmarks building what the Americans simply extracted from the earth.
They flared off fuel they considered excess. We rationed every droplet. This was not a contest of technology, but of unlimited resources confronting permanent shortage. When the Ardennes offensive collapsed on January 28, 1945, the consequences of this imbalance were visible everywhere. German troops abandoned about 15,000 vehicles during the withdrawal, most left behind not because they were destroyed, but because their fuel tanks were empty. Of the 600 tanks and assault guns lost, roughly 400 were immobilized by exhaustion of fuel rather than enemy fire.
American forces, meanwhile, consumed around 50 million gallons during the battle, more than Germany's total national reserves, and still finished the campaign with larger stocks than they had at the start. Throughout the fighting, supply units kept nearly 1.5 million gallons flowing to the front each day. After the battle, the 463rd Ordnance Evacuation Company cataloged the wreckage. They found Koenig's Tiger tanks abandoned with full ammunition racks, Panthers demolished by their own crews because they lacked a mere 100 gallons of fuel, and self-propelled guns shoved into roadside ditches when their engines sputtered dry. Each disabled vehicle stood as a literal monument to a military running on fumes. The Battle of the Bulge ultimately demonstrated that industrial capacity, not only tactics or battlefield experience, decided the outcome of mechanized warfare. Germany entered the fight with outstanding tanks, seasoned soldiers, and daring operational concepts, but the United States brought something even more decisive, an ocean of fuel and the logistical machinery to deliver it. In the modern age, victory belonged to the side that could keep its engines running. America entered the battlefield with something far more decisive than strategy or firepower, an ocean of fuel. Endless surging streams of gasoline powered its war machine, and General Eisenhower recognized this better than anyone. The German military fielded veteran troops, frequently superior armored vehicles, and well-prepared defensive lines, but their fuel existed in units of barrels, while the United States counted it by entire convoys of tankers. That imbalance shaped the outcome long before armies clashed. Hitler's final offensive, his last desperate attempt to reverse the war's direction, was effectively lost before a single artillery piece fired. The German plan depended on seizing American fuel stocks to keep their assault rolling. Yet even if they captured large depots, the American supply system was so expansive that losing vast quantities barely slowed them. The destruction of roughly 3 million gallons near Spa-Stavelot inconvenienced the U.S. for a moment. For Germany, failing to secure it sealed the fate of their campaign. The Battle of the Ardennes symbolized a turning point in the nature of warfare. Wars were no longer decided purely by maneuver or battlefield brilliance. Industrial output had become the decisive weapon. Victory flowed to the side that could sustain its armies with uninterrupted streams of fuel and supplies. American operational thinking embraced this shift, relentless logistics designed to keep units moving without pause. German doctrine, rooted in precision and battlefield finesse, had no answer for the stark limits of its material resources. Even the most skilled crews operating some of the most advanced tanks ever constructed could not fight when their engines were dry.
Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion during the relief of Bastogne, captured this new reality in a simple statement reflecting the American confidence in its supply network. He did not bother checking fuel gauges. He informed the logistics staff of his intended route and operated under the assumption that gasoline would be ready for him upon arrival. It always was. While German officers watched every leader vanish from their reserves, Americans measured success, not scarcity. For Germany, the Ardennes offensive delivered a harsh education in the requirements of modern conflict. Bravery could not be refined into gasoline. Determination could not substitute for crude oil. The army that once overran Europe with swift, tactically innovative operations met an opponent whose industrial capacity overwhelmed even the most sophisticated German machines. Former Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland later admitted the uncomfortable truth. Modern wars are determined not only by soldiers in the field, but by the factories, refineries, and geologists who enable those soldiers to move and fight. In his words, the German army was not defeated by superior battlefield skill, it was submerged beneath the sheer volume of American petroleum. The wreckage scattered across the Ardennes countryside illustrated this perfectly. Immaculately engineered vehicles, the Panthers, the King Tigers, stood abandoned, incapable of moving another meter. These extraordinary machines, weighing upward of 68 tons, became immobile monuments to a simple conclusion. Without fuel, even the most formidable tank becomes little more than a steel shell. The fuel shortage of December 1944 left a deep imprint on military thinking for decades afterward. Commanders worldwide learned that no operation should advance beyond the reach of its own logistics, and that reliance on captured enemy resources was a formula for disaster. For the United States, the Ardennes validated a philosophy that prioritized supply above all else. The capacity to move millions of gallons of fuel wherever and whenever necessary, regardless of terrain, weather, or enemy resistance, became a foundation of American dominance in modern warfare. From that point forward, every major American campaign would treat the delivery of fuel as the first and most essential condition for success. For the German troops who managed to survive the war, the memory of operating with barely a drop of gasoline would leave scars as deep as any battlefield injury. In their post-war writings, references to running dry appear far more often than accounts of taking incoming fire. Many of them came to believe that they had been overwhelmed not so much by superior enemy fighters, but by a nation capable of producing and transporting resources on a scale they could hardly imagine. Ultimately, the fate of the Battle of the Bulge was not determined by the skirmishes among the snow-covered firs of the Ardennes, but by the vast petroleum infrastructure thousands of miles away in Texas and Oklahoma. The 2.2 million gallons stored near Spa, fuel that Kampfgruppe Peiper failed to capture, was a trivial reserve by American standards, replaced in roughly 48 hours. For Germany, however, that amount equaled or exceeded the entire operational fuel holdings of multiple army groups. The contrast revealed a defining truth of 20th century warfare. The nation with greater industrial output could overturn the advantages of tactical expertise. American formations did not have to rely on exceptional marksmanship or innovative maneuver when they possessed a logistical system capable of replenishing their forces at a relentless pace. They did not need intricate planning when they enjoyed supply lines able to support sustained advances. What mattered most was the certainty that every tank, truck, and plane could be refueled whenever required. While German armored vehicles froze in place with their tanks bone empty, American columns rumbled forward in long, uninterrupted lines, engines idling without concern, consuming gasoline as if it were limitless. Each refilled tank demonstrated not only operational readiness, but the deeper power of an industrial economy in full motion. Thus, what is often described as the Western Front's greatest armored confrontation did not conclude in a dramatic final clash. Instead, it ended in the quiet stillness that comes when engines stall for lack of fuel. German crews stepped out of advanced machines they could no longer operate, leaving behind Tigers and Panthers rendered useless by empty fuel lines. Meanwhile, American units continued on in vehicles often technically inferior, yet rendered invincible by constant supply. The Ardennes campaign collapsed because it attempted to pit determination against mathematics. Germany tried to counter near-infinite American resources with finite reserves and hope. The fuel stockpiles at Spa and at Stavelot, amounts insignificant to American quartermasters, represented for Germany the impossible gap between its ambitions and its industrial capacity. They symbolized the larger contrast between a society organized around mass production and a military establishment still trying to win wars through skill and resolve alone. During those frigid days in December, alongside disabled Panthers half buried in snowdrifts,
German soldiers confronted the final law of modern mechanized conflict. Victory belongs to the side that can keep its engines running. They were up against an opponent whose petroleum supply was measured in tankers and pipelines, while their own was counted by the jerry can. The result had been set long before the first shots were fired, shaped by the location of oil fields, the output of refineries, and the reach of shipping routes. Inevitably, the offensive faded as German vehicles sputtered out one by one, while American fuel continued to flow without interruption. In the end, the road to Allied victory in the Ardennes was paved not by superior tactics, but by the sheer, unbroken momentum of American industrial abundance.